Someone so careless with protocol probably shouldn't be trusted with medications at all. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before the Marine in room for 47 coded. Seattle General's Atlanta branch smells of antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum at 60 Hz. Danielle Ross moves through the ICU like a shadow, efficient, unremarkable, her hand steady during first starts that other nurses miss twice. She wears her scrubs like camouflage. Her badge hangs from a lanyard she's wrapped twice around her neck so it doesn't swing. The limp on her left side is barely noticeable unless you watch her climb stairs, and she's careful to climb them when no one is watching. In her car trunk, locked in a toolbox painted army green, sits a pair of combat boots. The leather is cracked from desert sand. The soles are worn thin from 2-mile carries through Tikrit streets under fire. She never mentions them. She never even looks at them except at 3 in the morning when she sits in the parking lot with the engine off and her hands shaking against the steering wheel. Dr. Whitfield watches her during morning rounds with the attention of a man protecting something valuable. His eyes narrow whenever she speaks. His 47, silver-haired, wears a Rolex Submariner that costs more than her annual salary, and moves through the hospital like he owns it, which, in terms of narcissistic gravitational pull, he functionally does. He's a cardiologist with a corner office, a country club membership, and what Danielle suspects is a pharmaceutical vendor relationship that would make the DEA interested in his formulary decisions. But she doesn't say anything about that. She never says anything about that. The morning rounds follow their usual pattern. Dr. Whitfield presents cases with the precision of a surgeon and the arrogance of a man who has never been questioned. His residents circle him like pilot fish around a shark. The nurses stand at the periphery, invisible unless called upon to confirm vitals or medication times. Danielle stands near the back, her hands folded in front of her, her expression neutral as anesthesia. Room for 47, Dr. Whitfield announces, his voice carrying the particular timbre of a man accustomed to obedience. 23-year-old male, gunshot wound trauma history, currently recovering from infection, responding well to antibiotics. However, he pauses, and Danielle sees his eyes flick toward her. Not quite meeting her gaze. More like aiming at her. I have concerns about the baseline medication protocols on this patient. Some staff members appear more focused on procedure than process. It's a chronic problem in nursing departments. Danielle's jaw tightens. Once. Then stills. That, in my experience, is what happens when protocols are treated as suggestions rather than rigid frameworks, he continues, addressing the residents but speaking loud enough that every nurse in the hallway hears him. His tone is conversational. Casual. The way a man might comment on the weather. When individuals prioritize improvisation over institutional guidelines, we create liability. For the hospital. For the patient. For everyone. He's still not looking at her directly. The cowardice of it is almost impressive. One of the residents, a nervous third year with sweat marks on his collar, ventures a question. Dr. Whitfield, are you suggesting a specific protocol violation? Not suggesting. Observing. Dr. Whitfield adjusts his stethoscope. The movement is studied, theatrical. Certain staff members seem to struggle with the distinction between competence and recklessness. Miss Ross, for instance, retrieved aspirin from the vending machine yesterday. The vending machine. For a patient on her roster. That bypass alone suggests a pattern of disregard for pharmaceutical chain of custody. Danielle doesn't move. Her breathing stays level. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The technique is old, taught to her by a gunnery sergeant in a compound outside Fallujah while mortar rounds shook the sandbags above their heads. Control the breath. Control everything else. Not that I'm accusing anyone of incompetence, Dr. Whitfield says, smiling now. His teeth are very white. Very even. Very artificial looking. I'm simply suggesting that some individuals might benefit from a refresher on institutional guidelines before they're trusted with more critical decisions. Wouldn't you agree? The residents nod. The residents always nod. The rounds continue. They move through 3 more patients. Dr. Whitfield makes a note in the chart. Danielle can see him writing something, slow and deliberate, his pen pressing hard enough that the letters probably bleed through to the page beneath. His power move. His paper trail. His documenting the narrative. Building the case. She understands this immediately because she spent 18 years in systems where narrative is survival and paper trails are loaded weapons. By the time rounds end, Dr. Whitfield has mentioned protocol violations 4 times. Each time, his eyes drift toward Danielle's location. Each time, he's careful not to name her directly. The cowardice is intentional. It prevents her from responding. It prevents anyone from saying he's targeting her. It's just coincidence that she seems to be the person he's worried about. The fluorescent light above the charting station flickers twice, then settles into its hum. Danielle completes her shift with the kind of precision that should be setting off alarms. She starts 3 fours without missing once. She redresses a wound with hands that move like they're following muscle memory they shouldn't have. She enters medication times into the electronic record with the certainty of someone who has documented far worse things than aspirin distributions. Her face remains blank. Professional. Forgettable. The other nurses notice nothing. At 2:24 p.m., with 45 minutes left in her shift, she steps into the supply closet on the 4th floor. The one no one uses because it's too far from the main unit, too inconvenient, tucked behind a stairwell next to a defunct pneumatic tube system that used to carry samples to the lab before they installed pneumatic tubes in the new wing. The door closes with a soft click. The light is a single bare bulb. The shelves smell like industrial bleach and expired sterile packaging. She allows herself 3 slow breaths. The first breath is the recognition of what is doing. Building a case. Establishing a pattern. Creating institutional memory that she's careless, that she's untrustworthy, that she doesn't follow protocols. It's not accidental. It's surgical. He's laying groundwork the way a man lays foundation before he demolishes a structure. He's protecting something. Someone. The pharmaceutical vendor kickbacks are the obvious answer, but it might also be something else. It might be that he simply recognizes in her a person who doesn't belong in the hierarchy he's constructed, and hierarchy people like him don't tolerate threats to the order. The second breath is the acceptance that she can't fight this. Fighting back means exposure. Exposure means the Dod shows up asking why a scrubbed operative is working in a civilian hospital under a civilian name. Exposure means the protection detail that's kept her alive for 18 months, the carefully constructed bureaucratic invisibility, collapses. They'd made that clear during debrief. Disappear. Integrate. Don't call. Don't write. Don't explain. If anyone gets close, you disappear again. The third breath is the decision to endure it. Room for 47 sits at the end of the East Corridor, where the ICU transitions into intermediate care. The Marine inside is named Cooper. 23 years old. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder during a patrol outside FOB Falcon in 2019. The bullet nicked an artery, but he bled out slower than he should have because someone applied pressure for 40 minutes while he screamed that they should leave him, they should move forward, he was already dead. Someone carried him 2 miles through streets that were actively cooking with small arms fire. Cooper has no memory of this. The head trauma from a subsequent IED blast stole that whole section of his narrative. He wakes up in Seattle General's Atlanta branch 3 days ago wondering why his left shoulder feels like someone wrapped it in barbed wire, why he's having fever dreams about dark corridors and gunfire, why he wakes up at night gasping like he's drowning on dry land. And on his left forearm, in block letters he can't explain, he has a tattoo with a single name, Ross. Danielle checks his vitals at 2:52 p.m. Temperature, 98.4. Heart rate, 67, regular. Oxygen saturation, 97% on room air. The infection is breaking. He's going to recover. He's going to go home to whatever life he has left after Tikrit, which is usually not a life at all but a series of quiet rooms and bad sleep and the constant awareness that he's missing something he should remember. "How are you feeling?" she asks him. He looks at her. Really looks at her. For a second, something flickers across his face, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. The way you look at someone you should know but can't place. Then it passes. "I'm good," he says. "Just tired." Pain level. Like a 3. Down from 8 yesterday. She adjusts the 4 flow, checks the dressing, notes the numbers in the chart. All of it is muscle memory. All of it is what a good nurse does. What a Master Chief Petty Officer who now wears scrubs does when she's trying to disappear. She's about to leave when Cooper speaks again. "Hey. Did we know each other? Before?" Danielle pauses at the door. Her hand is on the frame. The question hangs in the air between them like something physical. "No," she says finally. "Different platoons." It's not a lie. Not technically. It's just the truth arranged in a way that doesn't disturb the surface. Cooper nods. He seems satisfied, or as satisfied as a man can be with amnesia and phantom memories that don't connect to anything. He closes his eyes. Danielle leaves the room and walks to the nurse's station. At 3:32 p.m., Dr. Whitfield arrives with 2 board members. He's holding a tablet. He's smiling. The smile is the kind of smile that comes before a knife. She hears him before she sees him, his voice carrying across the unit with practiced casualness. "I wanted to discuss the quarterly pharmacy audit results," he's saying to the board members. "I've noticed some concerning patterns in our formulary adherence. Some staff members seem to struggle with the distinction between competence and recklessness. Take the vending machine incident I mentioned this morning. Retrieving medications outside the pharmaceutical chain of custody is serious. It suggests." Danielle continues her work. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't acknowledge his presence. The next words she hears are meant for her, but they're addressed to the board members, which makes them impossible to respond to without admitting she was listening. That perhaps we need to evaluate baseline competencies more carefully when assigning personnel to critical care units. The fluorescent lights hum. The ventilator in room for 39 wee cycles. A monitor beeps somewhere in the unit, steady as a heartbeat. And what she doesn't know, what nobody in the hospital knows yet, is that the Marine in room for 47 is going to code in approximately 36 hours. He's going to go into cardiac tamponade from a complication that won't show up on any scan, from a slow bleed they won't detect until his blood pressure crashes and his oxygen saturation drops and every cardiology protocol fails. He's going to be 30 seconds from death. And Danielle Ross is going to save him in a way that makes it impossible for her to hide anymore. She's going to perform a procedure no floor nurse is trained to do, with hands that remember field medicine they shouldn't know, and the entire hospital is going to have to answer a question they don't want to ask: who the hell is she, really? But that's not today. Today is just protocol violations and pharmaceutical audits and the slow grinding of a man who's learned to weaponize institutional structure. Today is Danielle Ross moving through Seattle General like a ghost, doing her job perfectly, enduring something she's endured before and will endure again if that's what survival requires. She punches out at 3:45 p.m. and walks to her car. The combat boots are still in the trunk, locked in their box, waiting in the dark. The monitor screamed at 11:27 p.m. That specific sound, the rhythmic wail of a cardiac alarm spike, cut through the ICU like a blade. Danielle was at the medication station, restocking 4 push medications, when the noise registered not as sound but as instruction. Her body moved before her mind caught up. Room for 47. Cooper. She was there in 4 seconds flat, her shoes silent on the linoleum, her breathing already synchronized to what needed to happen next. Cooper was conscious, which was wrong. His neck veins distended like purple cords beneath his skin, his blood pressure dropping in real time, 138/72, then 131/68, then 119/54. His heart rate climbed, 128, 134, 141. The monitor displayed the numbers like a countdown to something irreversible. His lips had gone pale, almost translucent. "I can't breathe," he gasped, his eyes wild, the tattoo on his forearm, her name, visible as his arm thrashed across the blanket. The resident on night shift, a second-year named Chen, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth was open. Useless. Danielle didn't speak to him. She moved to the crash cart, her hands already assembling what she needed: the sterile pericardiocentesis kit, the 18-gauge needle, the syringe, the ultrasound probe. The attending was in OR. 20 minutes out, minimum. She had 5 minutes, maybe less. Cardiac tamponade didn't wait for hierarchy or credentials. The pericardial sac was filling with fluid, compressing Cooper's heart like a fist closing around his chest. One procedure. One chance. "Talk to me," she said to Chen, her voice dropping into the register she hadn't used in 3 years, the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders that people obeyed. What was his last documented output? Chen's eyes focused. 70, maybe 80 milliliters per hour. Then it stopped. When? 20 minutes ago. She was already prepping Cooper's chest with betadine, the antiseptic burning sharp and chemical in the air. The color of competence. The smell of a procedure that would work or wouldn't, and the difference between those two outcomes was exactly 120 cubic centimeters of blood that shouldn't be where it was. "I'm going to need you to hold the ultrasound probe right here," she said, positioning Chen's hand. "Right over the xiphoid process. Don't move. Don't speak. Just hold it." He nodded, his jaw tight. He understood now. He was watching someone who knew what they were doing with the kind of certainty that couldn't be taught in residency. It was the kind of certainty that came from having done this before in worse conditions, with worse light, with the sound of gunfire in the background instead of beeping monitors. The kind of certainty that made residents believe in God. Danielle's hands were steady, not the steadiness of someone calm, but the steadiness of someone whose nervous system had been trained to shut off everything except the task. She located the landmark, below the xiphoid process, the needle's angle already calculated. The pericardium was a sack of tissue surrounding the heart, and right now it was full of blood that had no business being there. One precise needle. One angle of entry. One aspiration that would either save his life or puncture something that mattered more. The needle went in. The angle was perfect, toward the left shoulder, threading through the muscle and fascia without resistance. She felt the slight give as the needle breached the pericardial space, the distinct sensation of entering a sealed compartment. Her eyes were closed. She was feeling, not seeing. The needle was an extension of her nerve endings. Then the syringe filled with blood. 50 milliliters. The color was dark, old blood, oxygen depleted, pooled. She withdrew slowly, maintaining gentle negative pressure. 75 milliliters. The monitor beside them showed Cooper's pressure ticking upward, 62 to 68. His heart rate dropping from its frantic climb. 100 milliliters. 110. 120. The moment the last few drops filled the syringe, his blood pressure jumped like a switch had been flipped, 98/60. Still low, but ascending. The monitor steadied into something that resembled a rhythm. His breathing eased. The purple cords of his neck veins began to flatten. She withdrew the needle, applied pressure with sterile gauze, taped it down with the precision of someone who had practiced this motion in the dark. Cooper's eyes found hers for 3 seconds, something flickering behind his pupils, a ghost of a recognition that his concussion and the morphine and 3 years of lost memory wouldn't allow him to hold onto. Then his pupils dilated and he slipped backward into unconsciousness, his body surrendering to whatever the trauma had stolen from his mind. Chen's hands were shaking. He set the ultrasound probe down on the bedside table like it might explode if he moved too fast. His voice came out fractured. Where did you learn to do that?" Danielle was already discarding the needle, stripping off her gloves, washing her hands at the sink. The water was warm. The soap smelled like industrial lemon. Everything felt distant and precise, as if she were watching someone else move through these motions. Documentation, she said quietly. Kept up with my certifications. It was not quite a lie. Certifications implied bureaucracy, paperwork, official channels. What she meant was something else entirely, a muscle memory that transcended hospitals, field medical training that transcended civilian practice, a set of hands that had learned their trade in places where people died if you hesitated. Dr. Whitfield arrived 9 minutes later, summoned by the code alert that had traveled through the hospital's wireless system like a whispered accusation. He stood in the doorway of room 447, taking in the scene. Cooper stabilized, the crash cart partially restocked, Danielle finishing her charting at the computer. His expression didn't change. His eyes did. She saw it, the moment when Whitfield understood that something he didn't control had just happened. That someone on his staff had demonstrated a level of competence that didn't fit the narrative he'd been constructing. That the timid nurse he'd been dismantling piece by piece had just performed a procedure that belonged in the hands of attending physicians, not ICU staff. He studied her the way a chess player studies an opponent's unexpected move. Not with anger yet. With calculation. The resident called the attending, Danielle said, looking at her screen. Procedure was initiated by myself due to clinical deterioration and unavailability of physician staff. All documentation is current. Resident witnessed. Patient stabilized. She said it in the voice of someone covering herself. Which meant she understood the implications. Which meant Whitfield understood that she understood. Which meant everything that came next was inevitable. By the next morning, the first call had been made. A board member named Patricia Jennings personally dialed the nursing school Danielle had listed on her credentials, Mount Carmel College of Nursing in Columbus, Ohio. Just verifying employment history, Jennings said, her voice polite and bureaucratic. Nurse Danielle Ross, graduated 2003, worked for us since 2007. I want to make sure everything's in order. The registrar confirmed the graduation date. Then Jennings asked the question she'd been coached to ask, and she has no gaps in her employment before joining us. No positions from 2003 to 2007. The registrar hesitated. Check the records again. It appears there's a 4-year gap, yes. We don't have any employment documentation for that period. That same morning, an insurance investigator named Morris showed up in the HR department before Danielle clocked in for her shift. He had a folder. He had questions. He had the kind of persistent, polite demeanor that came from being paid to dismantle people's lives slowly enough that they didn't notice until the foundation was gone. He asked about her background check. He asked about her employment history. He asked whether anyone had ever verified her references from the 2003 to 2007 period. HR began making phone calls. By 11 a.m., security had received an anonymous tip on their internal line, a voice, electronically distorted, claiming that Nurse Danielle Ross might be working under false credentials. The tip included enough specific details to sound credible: her shift schedule, her unit assignment, the fact that she'd recently performed a procedure that seemed outside her scope of practice. The security director forwarded the tip to the credentialing committee with a red flag. Danielle knew none of this until Dr. Whitfield appeared at her station at noon with a folder in his hand and 2 sheets of paper clipped inside. He was smiling. It was the smile of someone who had just executed a plan with precision. His teeth were very white. His eyes were the color of a shark's, which was to say, they held no malice because malice required feeling, and Whitfield was operating from pure calculation. Danielle, he said, using her first name in a way that made it sound like an accusation. We need to talk about your employment status. There are some discrepancies we need to clarify. She set down her pen. Looked at him without blinking. HR has been unable to verify your employment history for the period between 2003 and 2007, he continued, opening the folder. And there's been a complaint filed regarding the procedure you performed last night, a procedure that, technically, requires physician authorization to initiate. His smile thinned, became almost translucent. We're going to need you to step away while we investigate. This is termination effective immediately. She took the papers from his hand. Read them. The language was institutional, carefully constructed by legal counsel. Terminated for cause. Falsified credentials. Unauthorized medical procedures. Liability concerns. You can fight this, Whitfield said, and his voice dropped to something almost conversational, almost kind. But that means we go public with the investigation. We subpoena those for missing years. We ask questions about where you were, why there's no documentation, why a young nurse with a sudden employment gap is suddenly performing advanced procedures. He leaned against the counter, his posture casual, his intention clear. Or you can accept this, walk away, and we keep this quiet. Between us. And by us, I mean this institution. He was offering her a choice between two versions of exposure. Both of them meant exposure. One of them just meant exposure to fewer people. Danielle understood what he'd sensed before he'd fully articulated it, that she was hiding something. That there were records somewhere that were sealed, or redacted, or classified in a way that wouldn't survive scrutiny. That for years of her life had been erased in a way that was legal and official and designed to be irreversible. He didn't need to know the specifics. He only needed to know that the specifics existed, and that she would do almost anything to keep them buried. She folded the termination papers. Placed them in her pocket. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw clenched once, then stilled. Then she turned back to her station and began logging out of the computer system, her movements methodical and unhurried. I'm going on break, she said quietly, though there was no break to take, no shift to return from. She said it because she needed to say something that wasn't an acceptance and wasn't a capitulation. A small assertion that she was still present, still solid, still here. By that evening, she stood in the hospital laundry room folding her scrubs for the last time. The machines hummed their industrial drone, warm air rolling across her face, carrying the smell of bleach and detergent. She creased the sleeve seams with the same precision she'd once used to field strip her rifle, her muscle memory indifferent to whether the tool was medical fabric or military equipment. This was what came next. This was what came after the rooms and the lives and the careful construction of a civilian existence. The indignity of dissolution. The quiet unraveling of a cover that Whitfield had never needed to penetrate, he'd only needed to threaten the exposure of it. She folded the last scrub. Set it in the cardboard box. Turned off the machines. And walked out into the Atlanta night, where the rain had started to fall, hammering the pavement like applause for someone else's victory. The fever started at 2:36 a.m. on the third morning post-procedure. Cooper's core temperature climbed to 103.8 degrees, and the monitors began their anxious conversation, beeping in fractional increments, a mechanical voice speaking urgency in a language only nurses and doctors understood. Danielle wasn't there when it happened. She was home, standing in her kitchen with the lights off, holding a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the termination papers spread across her granite counter like a crime scene. The words blurred together, unauthorized procedures, credential discrepancies, suspicious employment gap. All of it true. None of it provable. None of it discoverable without excavating the classified vault where the Pentagon had buried her name. But by 6 a.m., when the infectious disease team arrived, she was already back at the hospital, not on the clock, not in her uniform, but in fresh scrubs she'd pulled from her locker before security could seal it, moving through the corridors like a ghost transitioning between dimensions. No one stopped her. No one questioned why the terminated employee was walking toward the ICU. Momentum and confidence looked identical from a distance. The ID team had ordered blood cultures, a urinalysis, a full panel for sepsis markers. Dr. Chen, the infectious disease attending, was already barking orders about broad-spectrum antibiotics before the cultures even came back. Vancomycin, piperacillin-tazobactam, and cefepime. 3 drugs working like a coordinated assault team, hitting everything they could find while the lab waited for the microbiologist to identify the actual enemy. It was the right call. Delay meant death in sepsis, and you didn't wait for certainty when a Marine's blood was being invaded by organisms invisible to the naked eye. Danielle stood at Cooper's bedside, checking his lines with hands that had started for access in sandstorms and field hospitals where antiseptic was a luxury. The fever made him restless. His eyes were still closed, but his body moved with a friction of internal fire, sheets twisted around his legs like he was fighting something only he could see. His tattoo, her name, Ross, was visible on his forearm where the fall line didn't cover it. 3 months in country, and he'd gotten it after the 3rd extraction. After Tikrit. After she'd carried him 2 miles through rubble and crossfire and the kind of heat that turned blood to syrup in your veins. He probably didn't even remember doing it. The shrapnel that took his memory had been thorough in its work. The room smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the sick sweet smell of fever, the body burning itself from the inside out. She was adjusting the antibiotic drip when the door opened and a man entered who shouldn't have been there. Not yet. The timeline was wrong. Everything was wrong about his arrival, except for the way his face changed when he saw her. Grey hair. 50-something. Wearing slacks that had been expensive 10 years ago and a blue button-down with the sleeves rolled. He was holding a worn leather briefcase like it contained the weight of continents. He'd come to help Cooper's family communicate with the doctors. That was the story his presence told. But his eyes told a different story entirely. His eyes told the story of someone seeing a ghost, and not metaphorically. Not in the poetic sense. In the way that a ghost meant dead, and the dead did not appear at bedsides in Atlanta hospitals wearing hospital ID badges clipped to their scrubs. He stopped mid-step. Froze. His briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the tile floor with a sound like a rifle being chambered. Then he whispered something in Arabic. 2 words. His voice was barely audible, but Danielle heard them with the precision of someone trained to hear whispers in IED-rigged villages and collapse sites where people were screaming underground. Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. She didn't turn around. She didn't change her breathing. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction, not the flinch, not the acknowledgement, not the single moment of surprise that would have told him she'd heard. Instead, she finished adjusting the antibiotic drip with the same deliberate care she'd used 20 minutes earlier. 3 more seconds. Then 4. Then she turned to face him with a kind of composure that came from having already died once and finding out the rumors were greatly exaggerated. The man's face had drained completely. The color didn't just fade, it evacuated. His hand trembled as he reached for the bedside rail, and Danielle watched him without expression, the way a sniper watches through a scope at a target that doesn't know it's being observed. She recognized him now. Farid. He'd been a translator during the Tikrit operation. Civilian contractor, worked for a firm that hired out to military operations, the kind of man who moved between worlds, American enough to survive in U.S. military circles, Iraqi enough to move through villages without standing out. He'd been part of the extraction team for 3 of the building rescue operations. He'd heard the code name they'd given her over the radio, the name that insurgents whispered in occupied territories and abandoned compounds. The Blue Angel. Not because she'd saved lives with gentleness. Because she'd made the hard choices look elegant. Farid backed toward the door. His eyes never left her face. He was trying to reconcile something, the image of a Marine's nurse adjusting 4 lines with the image of a woman who'd collapsed a 3-story building on 20 enemy combatants to buy extraction time for wounded soldiers. The math wasn't working for him. The numbers didn't add up. He started, then stopped. His English was perfect, American accented, educated, the English of someone who'd spent years translating between worlds and getting fluent at disappearing into whichever world paid best. I was looking for. He gestured vaguely at Cooper, but his eyes were still locked on Danielle. Family. Danielle said, her voice level as a surgical tray. 7 words. That was all she gave him. That was all he deserved. He nodded once, backing fully out of the room now, his briefcase still on the floor, abandoned like the evidence of his shock. The door closed behind him. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the ventilator's mechanical breath and the 4 pumps' digital tick, the hospital's heartbeat, the sound of survival measured in milliliters per hour. What he didn't know was that he'd just triggered a cascade that couldn't be stopped. By 1 p.m., hospital security had started asking questions. The terminated employee had been spotted in the ICU multiple times. Without authorization. Without her badge. Which shouldn't have been possible because her badge had been deactivated at 4:17 p.m. the previous day when Dr. Whitfield's administrative assistant ran the termination paperwork through the system. But Danielle hadn't used her badge. She'd walked in during shift change, when the ICU doors clicked open for staff cycling through, and no one had a protocol for stopping someone who moved like they belonged there. That was the advantage of composure. The world assumed anyone who acted certain, must belong, must be authorized to be wherever they were. Dr. Whitfield received the security report at 1:35 p.m. A call came through to his office, and his jaw tightened as he listened to the security chief explain the situation. His hands, soft hands, manicured hands, hands that hadn't touched a scalpel in 17 years, formed fists on his desk. He was losing control of the narrative. He'd fired the woman. He'd orchestrated her termination perfectly, weaponized her employment gap, created just enough doubt that fighting back would mean exposing whatever classified secret she was protecting. She was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to accept defeat with the quiet resignation of someone who had no choice. Instead, she was still in his hospital. Still moving through his corridors. Still, apparently, giving a damn about a Marine who'd already coded once and nearly died from a complication she'd prevented. His phone rang again. This time it was hospital administration. This time it was worse. The door to the break room opened, and a man in dress blues walked in, not Marine dress blues, Navy. The kind of uniform that meant officer, meant authority that didn't require administrative approval from a hospital board. Behind him was another man, this one in civilian clothes but carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without explanation. They were looking for room for 47. They were looking for Cooper. They were asking for Danielle Ross by name, which meant someone had talked, which meant Farid had understood exactly what he'd seen and had made exactly the right phone call. By 2:18 p.m., Danielle was standing at Cooper's bedside again when the security guard, Old Navy, 2 decades of service written into the lines of his face and the way he moved, entered the ICU. He was supposed to escort her out. Those were his orders. But he looked at her uniform, and something shifted in his recognition. Not the uniform. What the uniform sat on top of. The way she held herself. The absolute stillness in her shoulders that came from people who'd spent years learning that motion gave away position. Master Chief Petty Officer, he said, his voice cracking slightly at the rank. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of respect that only came when one warrior recognized another across the distance of 100 days and 100 bad decisions. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum overhead, that electrical buzz that exists in all hospitals, in all places where the stakes are measured in heartbeats and milliliters. Cooper's eyes opened. His hand moved across the bed rail, fingers shaking with fever and something else. The trembling wasn't fear, wasn't weakness. It was recognition. It was the instant before memory, that place where the body knows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. He lifted his sleeve, the one with the 4 line running through it, and turned his forearm toward Danielle. The tattoo was there, unchanged, indelible. Ross. Her name. The name he'd carved into his skin because somewhere in his body, even when his brain had been too broken to remember her face, his cells had retained the memory of the woman who'd carried him 2 miles through fire. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then the voice came, rough, fever-hoarsened, desperate with recognition. "You carried me," he said. 2 miles. After the shrapnel. They said I was gone already, but you wouldn't leave me. You carried me. The silence in the room became substantial. You could have operated in it. You could have built something in it, or destroyed something. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The ventilator wheezed. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, proof that life was continuing, that biology didn't care about classifications or secrets or the careful compartmentalization that the Pentagon had constructed around one woman's service record. That evening, the hospital laundry room sat empty except for the rhythmic hum of industrial dryers vibrating through the concrete floor. Danielle stood alone, folding her scrubs for the last time. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, a pale, sickly glow that made everything look drained of color. She creased each sleeve seam with surgical precision, aligning the edges perfectly, smoothing the fabric flat with the heel of her hand. The muscle memory was automatic. This was how she'd field-stripped her rifle once, years ago, in another life, each movement deliberate, economical, perfect. The scrubs went into a plastic bin marked returns without ceremony. No one witnessed this final indignity except the machines. Her locker was on the 4th floor. She climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, her boots echoing against the metal steps in a hollow rhythm that sounded like counting down. The locker was already cleared, her name tag gone, her personal items packed into a canvas bag. Inside was a single photograph taped to the metal door. Boot camp graduation. 23 years ago. Her face unsmiling, eyes forward, the kind of stare that had nothing left to lose. She slid the photo into her jacket pocket and closed the locker door. It locked with a click that sounded final. The worn combat boots remained in her car trunk, locked away like evidence. She drove home in silence, took the back roads through Atlanta, watched the city lights blur past the window without really seeing them. Her studio apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's dinner. She ate half a sandwich in the dark, standing at the kitchen sink, then moved to the edge of her bed and sat there for 40 minutes without moving. The wall was white. She stared at it and let her mind go quiet. This was what the Pentagon had ordered: disappear, become invisible, accept erasure. She had followed those orders for 18 years. She could follow them for 18 more if she had to. Pain is information. Silence is survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning arrived gray and indifferent, like every other morning. Danielle returned to Seattle General to collect her final paycheck and the last of her belongings. The hallway outside room for 47 was crowded, visitors, family members, a priest standing near the doorway. Cooper was awake now, sitting up in bed, color returning to his face. And then Danielle saw him. Farid. The Iraqi translator who'd pulled her from the rubble 17 years ago in Tikrit, who'd carried her to the extraction point when her left leg wouldn't support her weight. His face was older now, the lines deeper, but unmistakable. When he saw her, his entire body went rigid. His face drained of color. He stepped into the hallway, blocking her path, and his voice trembled as he spoke loud enough for the room to hear, Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. The code name the insurgents had whispered before they died. The name of the American operator who pulled 17 prisoners from a collapsed building in Tikrit before it exploded, who carried them through fire, who refused to stop even when the building burned. Everything stopped. Cooper's family went silent. A nurse dropped a clipboard. The sound of it hitting the floor was the only noise in the hallway, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Danielle's face remained expressionless, her posture unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted. The mask didn't crack, but the weight behind it became visible to anyone who knew how to look. Morrison, the Navy veteran who worked hospital security, had been standing near the nurse's station. When he heard those words, Al-Malik al-Azraq, his body stiffened. He turned slowly and studied Danielle. Really studied her. Her stance. The way she moved. The scars that crisscrossed the backs of her hands like a map of consequences. Recognition bloomed across his face like a chemical reaction. He stepped forward, his voice cracking like an old door opening after decades of being sealed, Master Chief Petty Officer. 2 more people said nothing. Danielle's jaw tightened once. That was all. Within 30 minutes, Morrison had made 3 phone calls. By noon, hospital security had been instructed to stand down. By 1 p.m., a general staff vehicle pulled into the parking lot. General Costiano stepped out, Tall, grey-haired, the kind of quiet authority that made the air pressure change when he moved. He carried a locked case and 2 uniformed officers flanked him like brackets around important text. The hallway outside room for 47 filled with bodies. Every nurse who could leave their station came. Residents. The chief of medicine. Even Dr. Whitfield, though he lingered near the back, his confusion turning to irritation, his face already composing explanations he might need to offer. General Castellanos opened the classified file. The pages were stamped restricted and bore seals Danielle had hoped never to see again. His voice was measured, precise, the kind of voice that carried without needing to raise in volume a Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. 3 Navy Crosses. He paused, letting that settle into the room. Silver Star. Another pause. Dr. Whitfield's face went pale. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. Operation Righteous Thunder, Tikrit, 2005. A resident whispered something, the prayer, maybe, or just a name repeated like evidence. Castellanos continued without breaking rhythm. 43 coalition and allied personnel extracted under fire from a collapsing insurgent prison complex. Master Chief Ross sustained shrapnel wounds to her left leg and continued to carry wounded personnel for 2 miles to the extraction point, refusing evacuation until all survivors were loaded. His eyes moved from the page to the room, then settled directly on Dr. Whitfield. She did this while bleeding out. While her leg was shattered. While the building burned behind her. Cooper lifted his left arm. His hand was shaking. The tattoo, Ross, was visible from across the room. His voice broke like ice in spring water. You carried me. They said I was already dead. The corpsmen said my injuries were too severe, that I was gone. You wouldn't leave me. He was crying now, openly, his face twisted with recognition of something he couldn't remember but knew was true. I don't remember your face. I got shrapnel through my head. I lost 12 years of memory. But I remembered your name. I got this tattoo so I'd never forget. He pressed his arm against his chest. So I'd never forget the person who wouldn't leave me. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electronic song. Farid stepped forward, his voice steady now, carrying the weight of a man who'd carried trauma for nearly 2 decades. I was held in that prison. In Tikrit. They used us as leverage against the coalition. I watched them plan massacres. I watched them prepare to execute us. And then she came. She came through the smoke like something that shouldn't exist in that kind of darkness. Like something made of light and rage and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The insurgents called her Al-Malik al-Azraq, the Blue Angel, because of her eyes. Her blue eyes in the dust and the smoke. She saved my life. She saved all of us. General Castellanos closed the file with deliberate slowness. The sound was crisp, final, like a door slamming on an entire era. He turned directly to Dr. Whitfield, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of a guillotine blade falling, and you fired her. Whitfield's mouth moved. There were credential discrepancies, protocol violations, the pharmaceutical. I had to maintain standards. The words fell apart like wet paper. Her records were classified and scrubbed by Dodd order, Castellanos said, his voice never rising, never needing to. She was legally required to remain invisible. Legally required to suppress her actual experience and training. You didn't know you were trying to destroy a decorated war hero because she saved a patient's life. You didn't know because you weren't supposed to know. But now you do. He paused. The silence stretched like taffy. Now everyone does. Danielle stood motionless in the center of the hallway, surrounded by people staring at her as if she'd just materialized from another dimension. Her face was composed, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. But something had shifted. The timid nurse who folded her hands and accepted insult silently was gone. In her place stood someone with the calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing the world could offer. The mask had been removed not by her choice, but by the accumulated weight of truth. And the real reckoning was still to come. The FBI arrived on a Wednesday morning in unmarked sedans that parked in the no-parking zone directly in front of Seattle General's main entrance. Nobody had to announce them. Their presence moved through the hospital like a pressure change, the kind that makes older people's joints ache before the storm hits. 2 agents in dark suits approached Dr. Whitfield's office on the 3rd floor at 9:53 a.m. His secretary watched them pass without speaking. They didn't need to speak. Their badges did the talking. The investigation had taken exactly 72 hours to crystallize from theory into handcuffs. When Whitfield requested credential verification through a third-party service 3 days earlier, the request triggered an automatic flag in DOD systems. Someone was trying to access scrubbed records. Someone was trying to access Danielle Ross's classified file. The Pentagon doesn't sleep when people dig at ghosts. Within 8 hours, a NCIS liaison contacted the FBI's white-collar crimes division. Within 24 hours, forensic accountants were pulling Whitfield's financial records. Within 72 hours, they'd connected every thread. The vendor kickback scheme unraveled with the precision of a pulled hem. $54,000 in consulting fees. No. $47,000. 3 vendors over 18 months. Preferential formulary placement. Protocol requirements that steered nurses toward expensive branded medications instead of generics. Whitfield received payments routed through shell corporations bearing addresses that didn't exist. The pharmaceutical representatives documented everything in emails. They always did. They believed their own mythology about plausible deniability. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The real catalyst sat in an afternoon case review from 4 months earlier. Danielle had questioned a medication order, a branded anticoagulant costing $2,400 per dose when a generic alternative cost $180 with identical efficacy. She'd asked the question with the politeness of someone accustomed to invisibility, "Doctor, could we review the formulary rationale?" That question threatened Whitfield's revenue stream. That single question made her a liability. His humiliation campaign against her didn't begin because she violated protocol. It began because she'd noticed the pattern. She was asking questions. She was watching. She was dangerous. So he'd constructed the termination with methodical precision, the credential verification, the anonymous tip, the board members summoned to the cafeteria, the public shaming designed to make her disappear. But he'd made one fatal error. He'd used a third-party service to verify credentials he knew were classified. He'd left a paper trail that connected directly to DOD systems. And DoD doesn't forgive breaches to classified records. Not ever. The agents found him at his desk, reviewing lab results that would never matter again. His jaw tightened when they entered. He knew. Some part of him had known the moment he requested that verification. He'd just believed himself powerful enough that the consequences wouldn't apply to him. He was wrong about that too. Dr. Marcus Whitfield. The agent's voice held the flat certainty of someone who'd delivered this line 1,000 times. Yes. We need you to come with us. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. His lawyer arrived 14 minutes later. His lawyer's lawyer arrived for hours after that. By evening, Whitfield sat in an interrogation room with his hands flat on a steel table, listening to agents describe evidence he believed was safely hidden. The pharmaceutical vendors had cooperated immediately. They were bigger than he was. They had better lawyers. They'd recorded every payment, documented every expectation, created a paper trail so clear a paralegal could follow it. Whitfield's leverage evaporated the moment the first email loaded on the screen in front of him. Just need him to push the branded protocol. He understands the arrangement. Payment scheduled for the 15th. The plea deal took 2 weeks to negotiate. No jail time. Permanent loss of medical license. $200,000 in restitution to the hospital and pharmacy systems he'd corrupted. 5 years probation. His lawyer called it a victory. It wasn't. It was the absence of something worse. It was the moment Whitfield understood that his credentials, his position, his carefully constructed authority, all of it was illusion. None of it protected him. None of it mattered. The following Wednesday morning, agents escorted him from the hospital in handcuffs. They didn't use the back exit. They used the main corridor. Whitfield's walk took him directly past the cafeteria where he'd stood with board members, speculating loudly about whether someone so careless with protocol could be trusted with medications. The cafeteria fell silent when he appeared. Staff members stopped mid-conversation. A nurse he'd humiliated on 3 separate occasions set down her coffee and watched him pass without expression. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. The silence was worse than applause. The silence was a verdict. His face went the color of old paste as officers guided him toward the exit. His hands shook. They always shake when men like him finally understand that the system that elevated them is the same system that can erase them. The press waited outside. The cameras flashed. The headlines wrote themselves: Atlanta hospital physician arrested for kickback scheme / Medicare fraud allegations against Dr. Marcus Whitfield / physician allegedly retaliated against nurse who questioned prescriptions. One nurse recognized him in a news article 2 weeks later and said aloud what everyone thought but didn't say: good. That's good. But that wasn't the worst part for Whitfield. The worst part came after the plea, after the humiliation, after the handcuffs. The worst part was the waiting, the knowledge that every moment of his remaining life would be smaller than the moment before. That was the real sentence. Not the probation. Not the restitution. The reduction. 2 months later, someone spotted Dr. Whitfield teaching a CPR certification class at Atlanta Community College's Continuing Education Center on Peachtree Street. The building smelled like floor wax and desperation, the kind of place where people went when better options had expired. Whitfield stood in a windowless classroom with fluorescent panels that buzzed like dying insects, demonstrating chest compressions on a rubber dummy with a painted smile that never changed expression. His hand shook as he pressed downward. 30 compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The dummy's chest didn't rise or fall. It just accepted the compressions with the indifference of plastic. Whitfield was earning $15 per hour. $15. His mortgage cost $4,200. His ex-wife had already filed for divorce proceedings. His medical malpractice insurance had cancelled his coverage. His hospital privileges, gone. His reputation, ash. 8 students sat scattered across the classroom, most of them scrolling through their phones. One, a young woman named Priya, had recognized his face from a news article and whispered to her friend, "That's the guy. That's the doctor." Her friend stared. Whitfield continued demonstrating chest compressions, the motions empty and mechanical, a man going through the physical act of being alive while something essential had been removed. When he spoke, his voice was smaller than it used to be. Tilt the head back. Clear the airway. Begin compressions at a rate of 100 to 120 beats per minute. Nobody took notes. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared. While Whitfield was demonstrating CPR on rubber, Danielle was standing in the rose garden at the White House, wearing dress blues so perfectly pressed they could cut. The fabric felt like the boundaries she'd finally been permitted to cross. Her medals hung in a straight line across her chest, ribbons representing classified operations that would never appear in any official history. The sun was August hot, pressing down like a physical weight. Around her stood 47 people, active duty personnel, civilians who'd been cleared at the highest levels, family members of the 43 lives she'd extracted from the collapsed building in Tikrit. Cooper stood at parade rest in his Marine uniform, his dress blues identical to hers except for the rank insignia, his left sleeve rolled precisely to show the tattoo. Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. Her name in Arabic script, inked into his forearm while he recovered in medical, a permanent reminder of hands that had carried him 2 miles through streets that wanted them both dead. Farid was there with his family, his wife, his 3 children, his mother, who wept without making a sound. the security guard from Seattle General, Petty Officer Morrison, stood in the second row in dress blues, his salute held until the moment the president approached. The president moved with the cadence of a man accustomed to speaking truths that couldn't be classified. He held a certificate embossed with seals that meant something at the level of government where secrets are currency. "Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross," he said, and the room held its breath at the sound of her true rank spoken aloud for the first time in public. "Your service to this country, classified for 15 years, saved 43 lives in Tikrit on September 14th. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal recognizes extraordinary heroism in service of the United States of America. This medal belongs to you. It always has. Today, it's finally allowed to be seen." He shook her hand. She didn't flinch. Her grip was steady as a surgical laser. Cameras flashed. The moment became permanent in 1,000 photographs and videos and news cycles. The nurse nobody noticed turned out to have been a Master Chief Petty Officer all along. The invisible woman had been decorated by the president. The ghost was finally allowed to be alive. That evening, Danielle returned to her apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew her name. She stood at her dresser and withdrew the worn combat boots from the bottom drawer, the boots she'd kept locked in her car trunk every day for the past 15 years, the only physical remnant of Tikrit she'd been permitted to keep. The leather was cracked from sand and heat. The soles were worn thin from walking that building, that street, those 2 miles with a Marine weighing 214 pounds across her shoulders. She'd carried him because leaving him behind wasn't an option that had ever existed in her decision tree. You don't leave brothers. Not in war. Not in life. Not ever. She purchased a shadowbox frame from a specialty shop on Wednesday, mahogany wood with UV protective glass and a deep cream backing. The shopkeeper didn't ask what it was for. Nobody asks. They just frame things and let the artifact speak. Danielle arranged her medals in the upper portion of the frame, the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, the 2 Purple Hearts, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal catching the light like a promise. Below them, she placed the boots side by side, the leather dark from the dust of operations that would never be declassified, the soles facing down so the world could see the wear. She hung the frame on the wall opposite her bed, the first thing she'd see every morning and the last thing before sleep. The president's words from the rose garden kept circling through her mind like a helicopter pattern over a landing zone. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That night, she made tea, black tea, no sugar, the way it had tasted in Kandahar and Fallujah and Tikrit. She sat by the window and watched Atlanta's skyline as the sun collapsed into the horizon, painting the city orange and then red and then the blue of safe darkness. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't check the locks twice. She didn't scan the street below for threats. She didn't keep a weapon within arm's reach. She simply sat, still and steady, a Master Chief Petty Officer who'd carried 43 people out of hell and asked for nothing but the right to be invisible in return. The recognition changed nothing about who she was, still quiet, still precise, still carrying the weight of decisions that would never become public. But it changed everything about who got to decide whether her life had meant something. The government had finally admitted it. The president had finally named it. The medals had finally been allowed to exist. And in that small shift from invisible to acknowledged, Danielle Ross took her first breath in 15 years that didn't require hiding. The quietest person in the room had never stopped holding everything together. Now, the room finally knew. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, like this video and subscribe for more stories about the warriors among us. Comment below, would you have fought back the way Danielle did, or would you have walked away? We post new stories every week, hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one.